Hey everyone, hope you're doing well. I thought I'd go for a Stockfish Leela Chess Zero game today, which I saw on chess.com in the Computer Chess Championships Rapid Finals. It caught my attention because the opening book is opening actually play a lot. So I think I thought it was quite interesting the way Stockfish played it. So the opening book actually, with Stockfish playing white, was d4, g6, e4, bishop g7, sorry, followed by c3, c6, bishop to d3, d6. So we're in a sort of modern setup with white now playing f4. Black can play d5, forcing white to sort of go e5 and sort of blockade his own bishop in. In this situation, black plays h5, knight to f3, knight to h6, so black's got an outpost, f5, he wants to put his knight on, bishop to e3, and instead bishop to f5. And this is the end of the opening book. And to be honest, engines give this line as really good for whites, but in practice it's actually hard for white to break through. For instance, if just bishop takes f5 here, knight takes f5, hitting the bishop. If the bishop drops back, then black can play moves like bishop h6, g3, and then just get his pieces out and play e6. And everything is just locked down. Look at all this pawn structure. It's going to be very difficult for white to infiltrate, and it's made difficult as well because look at white's pawn structure. All the pawns are on black squares, really limiting the scope of this bishop. So white is given as better here by a Stockfish, but in practice it is quite difficult. In the game though, after bishop to f5, Stockfish played bishop to e2, so it doesn't want to trade bishops, and I think that's an interesting approach because it sort of clogs black's setup up a bit. Most human players actually do take that bishop, to be fair. Typically here, I think I'd play something along the lines of bishop g4, because the bishop's more suited to that square, and you also want to try and get this knight into f5 at some point. You're not too scared as black to trade that bishop off for the knight. And by following the computer line, this is what would happen. So let's say knight to f5. This is another line that could have been played where there's a trade. Typically you play h4 to stop the g4 pawn from moving up. And if you just develop normally, you sort of get into this setup with bishop to e7, and you just manually castle the king as black. So again, you could argue that white's doing a lot better in this position, but it's very difficult for white to attack. The queen's got no squares to get into because the pawn covers it and the rook covers it. The bishop also does a good job of protecting this pawn. So white has to crash through somehow. It's just white really just has to do it at an opportune moment. Okay, so we'll get back to the game then. So after bishop to e2, Leela played knight to d7. Stockfish developed. Leela consolidated with e6. There was h3 preparing g4. The bishop went back to f8. Good square for it. And now a4 expansion. Queen b6 hits the pawn. Stockfish defends, and Leela also played a5. And now Stockfish jumps their knight into a nice outpost on g5. So I like Leela's next move. She played f6, hits the knight on g5 and just opens things up a bit. I think this is what black needs to do, otherwise they're just very passive. If Stockfish decided to take this off, you get into this variation, and knight to f7, and the knight's just come into all these outposts. This knight to e4 given, knight takes e4, bishop takes, knight to e5, and Leela can jump her knight into there. Again, another very even line, so it makes sense that Stockfish didn't go for this. He didn't take the pawn. Stockfish played knight back, Leela played knight to f7, and now Stockfish did play c4, trying to open things up a bit. Importantly, Leela got her bishop out in time. Otherwise, maybe Stockfish may have clogged up the position with c5 at some point. So castles, knight went to h6, and Stockfish did indeed clog up the position, played c5. Hitting the queen, so the queen is forced to retreat backwards. And Stockfish reorganises, plays knight to e1, probably playing knight to d3 to hit the bishop on b4. Leela plays b6, so trying to open up the position somewhat and attack and undermine the c5 pawn. Leela played knight to d3, hitting the bishop on b4. And finally, Leela trades his bishop off. Bishop takes d3, bishop takes d3, hitting the g6 pawn. And Leela blocked with knight to f5. I looked at f5 here as well. I thought that was quite interesting, trying to just clog up and just totally block the position. Computers really do hate playing against this type of structures. But then maybe Stockfish could take, queen takes, queen c2 would be quite interesting, but then maybe bishop takes knight, queen takes, and you get into this sort of setup. So maybe this is good for white because you can reroute your bishop to f2 to h4. Saying that though, white does have to be careful of this pawn, and maybe if black just gets their rook across, it could be quite a drawish game, especially with everything clogged up in the centre. So a very close position. Knight to f5 though in the game. C takes b6 was played, queen takes b6, and Stockfish captures the knight, which makes a lot of sense because the bishop on e3 was attacked. The g pawn takes, opens up the g file, and knight to f3. So I think Stockfish is shoring up the position, protecting d4 and protecting e5. As f takes was played, f takes. So now the bishop is clear to manoeuvre. Say that though, Leela does have their own bishop. Leela castle queenside. Bishop d2 was played, followed by c5. So this isn't actually a threat because it's still pinned, but black does have some threats of their own, eyeing up the king. So it makes sense why Stockfish played just king h1. Also gets off the g file for any tactics as well. Rook d to g8 was played. There's a trade of bishops, queen takes, and now rook to a3. And I think now Stockfish may be doing better because the king's kind of not got really a safe place to hide. The king's safety could be an issue. Rook c3 ideas are coming, followed by b3 perhaps. And I think this is what may cost Leela the game. I did think about playing c4. Maybe black could play c4 here. But then I think, as I say, rook c3, king to b8 to get off the pin. Now b3. And if rook c8, all of a sudden white is crashing in. Obviously a lot of trades, but then comes check, king a7, rook c1. You can counter, but then this position does look good for white. Even after queen b4. White can manoeuvre this way. This is the computer line. You get this set up with queen takes h5, and it's kind of a race to see who's going to queen first, a pawn or the h pawn. But Stockfish is giving us better here. So back to the game, king b7 was played to get off the c file, and now knight to g5, hitting out at the e6 pawn. Rook g6 protects the pawn and threatens to double on the g file. Stockfish takes on c5 and now plays rook to c8, so we're going to try and recapture that c5 pawn. And a nice move by Stockfish, rook to f4, hits the queen. And a very nice move from Leela, queen b6. Imagine if you played that in your game. So the pawn on the c file is pinned because then rook takes c1 is coming with check. It's just a very brass move and bold move. Stockfish just played b4 though. A takes b4 was played, and a nice move by Stockfish now, queen to e1. So the c pawn is still hitting the queen. The queen has to move, queen takes c5 was played. But now this white can play rook takes b4, wins the pawn back with check, and king to a8, and this king does not look safe at all. At least white's king is relatively safe. They play king to h2, getting the king to another safety square, and getting off the back ranks. There's no queen c1 ideas anymore. If black decided to take this knight off, then white should win the game, and black's in a lot of trouble. There's rook b5, followed by rook to a5. So the queen's hit. If the queen retreats to c7, there's moves like rook a to b3, followed by rook to a5. Delivering checkmate, I'm going to win the queen, black's queen as well. So knight g5, the knight on g5 isn't really under threat at all. Rook b8 was played, so to trade off some rooks. So rook takes is played, knight takes is played, rook to c3 hits the queen. The queen went to b4. And the knight is now forced to drop back because it is under attack. Protects the e5 pawn, and it's pretty much equal material except white's got a passed a pawn, but the king is in front of it. Black can't take this pawn at the moment because then comes queen to c1, threatening rook to a3, and this just causes all sorts of issues. Like if the king moves away, then there's queen to b2, and you'll just play rook to a3 anyway and pin the queen against the king. Knight to a6 was given as the best move, but still rook to a3, queen c4, and you just pick up the knights on a6 with check. So this is a win for white. In the game, Leela played queen to b2 instead. Stockfish played knight to h4, hits a rook, rook retreated, and now rook to c8 pins the knight. Threatens moves like queen to a5 coming for whites, and luckily this knight's also protecting g2 against black's rook and queen. King b7 hits the rook comes back to c1, threatening rook to b1. Queen went to d4, the knight drops back to f3, hits the queen again. There's a check thrown in, king retreats, and rook to c7, offering a trade of rooks, which Stockfish kindly accepts, and plays queen a5 check, king b7, and another check. And yeah, black's king, again, as we've said before, isn't really safe. Queen to b6, hitting e6, and there's no real way to defend this. Black's pretty much forced to give a load of checks. So queen c1, king h2, another check, king to g1, another check, and king to f2. I looked at if black keeps on checking here. So queen c2, there's king to g3, f4, king takes, queen takes a4, and white can actually block it and has a much better position. Black can of course continue, but then comes queen c6 check, takes, and if a move like king b7 there's check, so you can't really play that, and most likely the king is just too quick here. We'll take off his pawn, and you've got double pass pawns there. Stockfish should win that position. So this is why Leela stopped giving the checks. Instead she played h4, so setting up another load of checks to play. So queen c2 to stop the king running away. Queen takes e6 anyway though, and now comes more checks. Queen c5, king e2, some more checks, but eventually black does run out of them. So queen takes a4 with checks, wins back a pawn, but eventually the king hides on f2. If queen c2 again, you can actually hide on h2, because after a few more moves you play this move, knight to g1. In the game, Leela played king to b7, and now queen to e7. Sorry, check is played, and white picks up this important h4 pawn, allowing the king to retreat to g3 at some point if need be. There was knight to c6, so hitting out at this pawn. Queen f6 protects the pawn. d4 is played. There's a check. Another check, and the queen comes to d6, pinning the knight on c6. d3 though, this is looking quite dangerous for white, but Stockfish does have a pass pawn of their own, and it's going to be quite hard for now for black to advance this pawn any further. King to a7 unpins the king. King to g3 was played, the king went back to b7, and now h4 was played. So Stockfish preparing to march another pawn up the board. A check is thrown in, the queen went back to e4, and Stockfish pushes the pawn up even further. Leela played queen to e3, stopping h6, the king went to g3 again, the knight comes in to d4, and now queen to b4 with check. King went to c8. And I should point out, actually, I think queen takes, knight here loses due to queen takes, knight takes, and you can just push this pawn up to d2, and there's no way white can stop that. So you can't take the knight. Instead, Stockfish played queen c5 check. King went to b7. King to h3. The knight is now pinned for black, so they play d2. Queen b4 from Stockfish, and Stockfish picks up the d2 pawn. There's a trade of queens, knight takes e6. It does look quite drawish. White's actually a pawn up. So we'll see how Stockfish finishes his off. Knight to f3 was played. King to d6 and now h6. Knight to f8, stop h7. But now king h4. And White's position is too powerful at the moment. I mean, if Black comes in with king to e6, then king g5 should win, because let's say king f7, you just take the pawn. If knight to h7, you just play king g6, and you're going to queen that pawn. So White's position looks strong. King d5 was now played, and I think Stockfish just wins this game now, king g5. And he's too quick. Eventually gets a queen, and Stockfish delivers a nice checkmate. Queen b7 is mate, and Stockfish defeated Leela. Obviously these weren't the most powerful moves because it was a rapid game, 15 minutes each with a 3-second increment. But yeah, a very nice game by Stockfish. Obviously had the computer advantage out of the opening, but it was just quite interesting to see how they converted the game. And I was just interested to see how they did out of this opening, because it's usually quite a difficult one to break down. So I went all the way to the end game as expected, and luckily managed to sneak the h-pawn through, which is actually quite typical in these type of games. Anyway, hope you enjoyed my analysis of this game. Obviously I couldn't cover every single line. I mean, the computers are ridiculously strong, so obviously I'm going to miss a lot of details. But hope you enjoyed anyway. If you did, please do feel free to drop a like, comment or subscribe, it really helps. And hopefully I'll see you in another video. Take care.